They called it the most foolish thing a vampire lord could do during a lunar frost, an underground chamber filled with enchanted roses, carved deep into frozen earth, while the blood-red moon promised temperatures so brutal that even immortal flesh would crack and ancient blood would crystallize in veins. Vladrik Thornheart built it anyway, ignoring every whisper, every contemptuous glance, every warning that he was wasting precious centuries of accumulated power on madness. 12 newborn vampires huddled inside that impossible sanctuary, while the sky turned the color of dried bone and the frozen wind began to howl across the eternal night. What nobody understood yet was that in 3 nights, Vladrik's folly would be the only reason any of them survived at all. And the lords who mocked him loudest would be the ones begging to know his secret. Vladrik Thornheart knelt inside the rose chamber 3 nights before the lunar frost descended, his pale hands running across the crystalline walls he had spent decades cultivating. The structure extended 40 feet beneath the surface, its curved ceiling covered in climbing roses that glowed with soft crimson light, each bloom pulsing gently like a sleeping heart. His shadow wolf, Ember, sat at the entrance passage, watching the darkening sky above with the kind of attention that made Vladrik's ancient instincts tighten. The beast sensed something approaching. Vladrik did too. He had spent the last century studying the patterns, feeling the particular kind of cold that crept through his bones, understanding that this lunar frost would be different from any in recorded memory. His 12 newborn vampires, turned 2 recently in the season, would not survive in the stone fortress that had sheltered his coven for 800 years. The walls had too many cracks where frost could penetrate, too many spaces where the killing cold could steal warmth faster than any bloodfire could restore it. He had tried to explain this to his consort Celine 2 decades ago, when she discovered him sketching the chamber design on ancient parchment by candlelight. She had studied the drawing for a long moment, then pressed her cold lips to his forehead without saying whether she believed him brilliant or lost to madness. Vladrik supposed that silence was answer enough. The mockery began the night Lord Kale Shadowmere rode past the construction site and observed Vladrik directing workers to plant the first circle of enchanted roses. Kale halted his nightmare stallion in the middle of the path, crimson eyes burning, and watched for several long minutes before his voice cut through the darkness. "Building a nursery garden, Thornheart?" His words carried the particular venom of a vampire who found something both amusing and insulting simultaneously. Vladrik continued working, placing each rose with careful precision, checking depths and spacing he had calculated through countless nights of study. "Sanctuary chamber," he said, without looking up. "For the newborns." Kale laughed, a sound like bones scraping against stone. "Sanctuary made of flowers. How precious. You might as well construct it from morning mist and prayer." He rode away before Vladrik could respond. The damage spread like poison through blood. By the following sunset, every vampire lord within the Northern Territories knew that Vladrik Thornheart had surrendered to senility and was squandering his power growing roses underground like some lovesick poet. The next night, 3 more lords paused at the border of Vladrik's domain. They pointed and shook their heads, their laughter carrying across the frozen landscape. One of them, Lord Vorn Blackwell, actually dismounted to offer counsel. "You understand roses generate warmth?" "Certainly," Vorn said, adjusting his ancient cloak with practiced elegance. "But they are also fragile. One touch of true frost and your entire garden withers to nothing." Vladrik wiped earth from his hands despite the cold that made the soil feel like crushed ice. "These roses are different, cultivated from blood and shadow. They draw warmth from the earth itself, from the sleeping fire at the world's heart." Vorn studied him as though he had begun speaking in tongues of the dead. "Earth warmth. Vladrik, we're discussing newborns, not geological curiosities." But Vladrik had performed the calculations through endless nights of research. 12 newborns, each one generating heat simply by existing, by moving, by processing the blood that sustained their new immortal forms, contained within a chamber whose living walls would capture and multiply that warmth. The enchanted roses would breathe it back, would circulate it, would build it into something more sustaining than any bloodfire could maintain without constant feeding. The ancient science made perfect sense to him, even if it transformed him into a fool before everyone who mattered. By the time he completed the chamber, sealing the final rose into its crystalline holder and securing the entrance with warded stone that he could open with a touch, half the vampire nobility had visited to witness the spectacle. Lord Cale Shadowmere returned, this time accompanied by 2 other ancient lords in his entourage. They stood at the edge of Vladrik's domain, arms crossed beneath elaborate cloaks, observing him guide the 12 newborns into the underground passage one by one. The young vampires descended willingly, their pale bodies still uncertain in their new immortality, their crimson eyes wide with trust that made Vladrik's chest ache with responsibility. Their soft sounds of wonder at the glowing roses echoed up through the passage. "You will lose every one of them," Cale called across the frozen ground. "And when you do not come begging to the rest of us for permission to turn replacements." Vladrik straightened, meeting Cale's burning gaze across the distance between them. "I will not need to," he said quietly. Cale made a sound of pure contempt and turned his stallion away. As the hoofbeats faded into darkness, Vladrik felt the first ice crystals begin to form in the air around him. They materialized slowly at first, almost gently, touching his face like frozen questions about everything he had risked. The Bloodseers that morning had delivered their final warning. "Extreme cold approaching," they announced through the psychic channels. "Historic temperatures never recorded in vampire memory. Conditions lethal to any immortal caught without proper shelter." Vladrik sealed the warded stone across the chamber entrance and felt the protective magic settle into place. Below, he could sense the newborns arranging themselves among the glowing roses, their small sounds of comfort barely audible over the rising wind above. What he could not sense yet was the condition of Lord Kali's newborns, 24 of them, secured in the traditional stone crypt, 2 leagues distant. But in 3 nights, that silence would tell a story that no vampire in the Northern Territories would ever forget. The temperature plummeted 12 degrees in the first 6 hours. Vladrik stood at the window of his fortress tower at the 4th hour past midnight, a goblet of warmed blood growing cold in his hand, watching the crystalline formations outside multiply and spread across every surface. The Bloodseers had issued a new warning through the psychic channels an hour ago, their mental voices tight with the kind of concern that made even ancient vampires pay attention. "Temperatures lethal to exposed immortal flesh by dawn," they announced. "Cold intense enough to crystallize blood within veins. Wind severe enough to strip the very essence from an unprepared vampire in under 3 minutes." Celine materialized behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders, her presence a comfort that required no words. She did not ask if the newborns would survive. She had learned across their centuries together that immortality meant living with questions that had no answers until fate decided to reveal them. The psychic summons came at the 5th hour. Lord Cale Shadowmere's mental voice pierced through the darkness, rough with exhaustion and something that might have been concern or might have been satisfaction. "Simply ensuring you have arranged proper contingencies for when that flower garden of yours freezes solid," Cale's thoughts transmitted. "My crypt has sufficient space if you wish to transfer your newborns before they crystallize into statues." Vladrik felt Celine's arms tighten around him. "I appreciate the consideration," Vladrik responded through the mental link, keeping his thoughts carefully neutral. "But they remain where they are." Cale's mental presence was silent for a moment, and Vladrik could sense other vampires in the background of the connection. The psychic impressions of lords moving their covens, of desperate preparation. "Your destruction then," Cale finally transmitted. "Or theirs, I suppose." The connection severed abruptly. Vladrik set the goblet down carefully, fighting the urge to descend into the chamber immediately, to check on the newborns, to reassure himself that his calculations were not the desperate mathematics of an ancient vampire who had gambled everything on being right. By the 7th hour, 3 more lords had sent psychic inquiries. By the 8th, Lord Vorn Blackwell appeared at the fortress gates with a convoy of servants, offering to transport the newborns to his domain, where he maintained extra chambers in a blood-warmed crypt. "No shame exists in acknowledging when something proves inadequate," Vorn said, genuine kindness evident in his ancient features. "We all attempt innovations. Not all of them succeed." Vladrik thanked him and sealed the gates. He pulled on his heaviest cloak, wrapped protective enchantments around his body until only his eyes remained exposed, and walked out into wind that felt like it was attempting to tear the immortality from his bones. The journey to the underground chamber required twice the normal time, each step a negotiation with ice and cold that made even his ancient lungs ache with effort. When he finally reached the entrance, he found the warded stone covered in frost patterns so thick they resembled white lace made of frozen lightning. His hands trembled as he pressed his palm against the ward, activating the ancient magic. Fear climbing his spine that he would find 12 pale bodies frozen in whatever positions they had assumed when death finally claimed them. The warmth struck him like a physical force. Vladrik stopped just inside the passage, his mind struggling to process what his body already understood. The air within the chamber was warm, not slightly less cold, not marginally improved. Warm. He released the protective enchantments from his face and felt the temperature against his pale skin, felt the impossible reality of standing in comfortable warmth while above him the wind screamed with temperatures that would crystallize ancient blood. The 12 newborns lay arranged in a loose circle among the glowing roses, their breathing deep and peaceful, their young bodies relaxed in genuine rest. One of them, a small female with hair the color of midnight and eyes that had been the palest blue in her mortal life, lifted her head to observe him, then settled back among the crimson blooms as though his presence was interesting but not urgent. Vladrik knelt on the soft earth, pressing his bare hand against the crystalline wall where roses pulsed with gentle light. The stone was cool to touch, but not cold. The enchanted flowers were performing exactly as he had calculated they would, drawing warmth from the earth's deep heart, capturing the newborn's body heat, holding it like ancient magic holds secrets, creating a sanctuary that defied everything happening 40 feet above on the frozen surface. He remained for an hour, observing the newborns, checking each one individually, running his hands over their warm flesh and sensing their strong heartbeats under his palms. When he finally emerged back into the brutal cold, he discovered Lord Kael Shadowmere's black carriage halted in his domain, dark horses stamping impatiently, Kael standing beside the vehicle with 2 other ancient lords. They watched him walk back toward the fortress, observed him move without urgency, without the body language of a vampire whose coven was dying. Kael stepped forward as Vladrik approached. "How severe is the damage?" he called across the frozen ground. Vladrik stopped, turning to face the 3 lords, and released the protective enchantments so Kael could observe his expression clearly. "They are sleeping," Vladrik said. Kael's face performed a complicated transformation, moving through disbelief and confusion before settling into something that resembled fury. "That is impossible," he said. Vladrik shrugged slightly and continued walking. Behind him he heard Kael's boots crunching through frozen earth, heard the ancient lord's voice rising with something between demand and desperation. "Thornheart, wait. You're claiming that Flower Chamber is keeping them warm through this?" Vladrik paused at his fortress steps, one hand resting on the iron railing. "Warmer than your crypt, I would estimate," he said quietly. The words fell between them like drops of blood onto fresh snow. Kael stood there, his aristocratic face contorting with something that extended beyond simple cold. Then he turned and strode back to his carriage. The horses surged forward before the door fully closed, the vehicle fishtailing slightly on the ice as it raced away, heading back toward Kael's domain, where 24 newborns huddled in a stone crypt that possessed more gaps than walls and blood-warming systems that could not compete with cold now settling over the northern territories like a death sentence. By midday, the temperature reached depths no vampire could remember experiencing, and the lunar frost that had been threatening for 3 nights finally arrived with the force of something that had been gathering its strength specifically to demonstrate a point. The wind ceased being merely wind and transformed into something solid, something possessing weight and malevolent intention, slamming against fortresses and crypts with sounds like distant thunder from a war between ancient gods. Vladrik stood at his tower window and watched his domain vanish behind walls of swirling ice crystals and frozen mist. He could no longer perceive the entrance to the underground chamber, could no longer perceive the outer walls, could no longer perceive the boundary markers that defined where his territory ended and the wilderness began. The world had contracted to the dimensions of his fortress, and somewhere beneath that white violence, 12 newborns were either alive or they were not. And there existed no method to verify without risking his own existence walking into conditions that could destroy even an ancient vampire before he traveled 50 yards. Celine sat in the great hall behind him, monitoring the psychic channels that connected the vampire nobility. The reports were devastating, worse than devastating. Travel forbidden across all territories, emergency protocols activated, rescue operations suspended until conditions improved. And between the official announcements, the personal communications were beginning to flood through the mental networks. Lords reporting newborns down. Young vampires crystallizing in crypts that could not maintain warmth against this magnitude of cold. Entire bloodlines ending in chambers that had protected covens for centuries. Lord Vaughan Blackwell transmitted around the 13th hour to report he had lost 4 newborns despite his blood-warmed crypt. The warming systems could not maintain pace. His mental voice carried the weight of exhaustion and grief. The ones positioned nearest the walls simply crystallized where they rested. Vladrik felt Celine's hand find his across the space between them, felt her squeeze once with intensity. She did not mention that she was contemplating their 12. Did not mention that every report of loss increased the weight of uncertainty. She did not need to express it. The psychic summons came at the 14th hour, urgent and desperate. Vladrik opened his mind to discover Lord Kael Shadowmere's thoughts piercing through like shattered glass. His mental voice carrying the kind of damage that extreme cold and desperation inflict on even ancient composure. His psychic presence was fractured, and not merely from the interference of the storm. "I require knowledge of your methodology," Kael transmitted without preamble. "I require understanding of how that chamber functions." Vladrik allowed the connection to stabilize, sensing the raw edges of Kael's thoughts. "Lost 2 already," Kael continued, the words emerging flat and brutal through the mental link. "Perhaps more by now. Cannot even reach the crypt to verify. The winds are too severe." His thoughts carried something that was no longer quite fury, something that had been hollowed out and replaced with a species of desperate calculation. "You were correct," Kael transmitted, and the admission seemed to cost him something vital. "I do not comprehend how, but you were correct." Vladrik settled into a chair, organizing his thoughts carefully before responding. "Body heat," he transmitted. "That is the entirety of it. 12 newborns in an enclosed space. Walls constructed to capture their warmth, chambers small enough that they heat the air simply by existing, by processing blood, by breathing." Kael's mental presence flickered with something like anguish. "My crypt is larger. 24 newborns, more space. They cannot generate sufficient heat. The cold penetrates through the stone." His thoughts sharpened, focusing on Vladrik with intensity that bordered on painful. "I mocked you. Called your idea the most foolish thing I had witnessed in 8 centuries. Vladrik acknowledged the memory. Everyone remembered. Kael's voice had carried the farthest. His contempt had been the most public, repeated across every gathering of vampire nobility. "I require you to tell me they survive," Kael transmitted quietly. "You're 12. I require you to tell me that impossible flower chamber is actually functioning, because if it is, if they still exist through this, then I must understand how to construct something similar before I lose the remainder of mine." Vladrik rose and moved to the window again. The storm displayed no indication of relenting. If anything, it was intensifying. The wind now carrying sounds that seemed almost sentient, howling and shrieking around the fortress like the voices of forgotten dead. "Cannot verify their condition until this breaks," Vladrik responded through the link. "Could be hours, could be tomorrow." Kael's presence pressed closer, desperate. "But you believe they survive?" Vladrik contemplated the warmth he had experienced that morning, contemplated the sleeping newborns among the glowing roses, contemplated calculations that had seemed so clear on parchment and so terrifying to trust with immortal lives. "Yes," he finally transmitted, "I believe they survive." Kael's mental presence shifted, something transforming in the quality of his thoughts. Some kind of barrier collapsing that had been constructed over centuries of certainty about how things should be done, about how the old ways were always the correct ways. "When this concludes," Kael transmitted, "when we can venture out and verify if they survive, I will assist you in constructing another chamber. For my newborns. For anyone who requires it." He paused, his thoughts carrying the weight of a difficult truth. "And I will inform everyone I was wrong about you." Vladrik did not transmit that being wrong had already cost Kael 2 newborns, perhaps more. Did not transmit that admissions after the destruction accomplished nothing for the dead. He simply acknowledged the offer for what it was worth. Outside, the lunar frost screamed on, the blood-red moon barely visible through the swirling chaos of ice and wind. And somewhere in that frozen violence, 12 small immortal lives were either proving him brilliant or burying his reputation, forever beneath cold that would not release the northern territories until the moon cycle completed. But the storm maintained its grip on the vampire territories for 18 hours without pause. Vladrik attempted to enter the death sleep and could not, lying in his chamber listening to the fortress groan under the assault of wind that seemed determined to tear ancient stone apart. Selene eventually rose and warmed blood at the 3rd hour, neither of them speaking, both of them contemplating the same 12 young bodies somewhere beneath that frozen darkness. The psychic channels kept transmitting updates, and each one brought news of more losses. Lord Soren Duskfall lost his entire newborn generation. 16 young vampires crystallized in a crypt where they had gathered together seeking warmth that never materialized. Lord Marcus Nightwell reported his crypt ceiling had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated ice, crushing 3 newborns and injuring 5 more. The numbers kept climbing, a brutal accounting of what occurred when nature decided to remind immortals exactly how fragile their control truly was, how even creatures who had conquered death itself remained vulnerable to forces older and more powerful than any blood magic. Kale transmitted again at dawn, his mental voice barely coherent through the interference of the storm, and something that sounded like grief made audible. He had lost 4 more newborns overnight, bringing his total to 6 destroyed out of 24. The ones still existing were weak, he reported, their blood growing sluggish despite every warming ritual he could perform, despite enchanted fires and every technique he had accumulated across 8 centuries. I am observing them crystallize, Kale transmitted, and there was something shattered in his thoughts that Vladrik had never sensed before. I am standing directly before them, watching them fade, and there is nothing I can accomplish. Vladrik closed his eyes, gripping the edge of his chair with force sufficient to crack the ancient wood. The storm is supposed to break by the 20th hour, he transmitted. Maintain your efforts until then. Kale's mental presence flickered with something between bitter laughter and despair. Maintain efforts, certainly, as though they possess any choice in the matter. The connection grew quiet for a moment, filled only with the psychic static of the storm and the distant impressions of suffering across the territories. You're 12, Kale finally transmitted. They might still exist, you understand. That ridiculous flower chamber might actually be the only thing that functions. The connection severed before Vladrik could respond. By the 19th hour, the wind began to ease. Not cease, but shift from a scream to a roar to something that was merely dangerous instead of lethal. Vladrik stood at his window and watched the world slowly reappear, ice-covered and transformed. Familiar landmarks buried under crystalline formations that reached second-story windows in places and created entirely new geography where flat ground had existed before. The temperature still registered at levels lethal to exposed flesh, cold sufficient to destroy, but the wind chill was decreasing, the sustained gusts that had made travel impossible finally fragmenting into something survivable for an ancient vampire with proper protection. Vladrik pulled on every enchanted garment he possessed, wrapped his body in protective magic until only his eyes remained exposed to the elements, and stepped out into a landscape that resembled the surface of some hostile frozen realm from nightmare tales told to frighten young vampires. The ice came up past his knees in places, and the distance to the underground chamber, normally a journey of several minutes, required nearly half an hour of exhausting struggle through formations that fought every step as though the frozen ground itself resented his passage. He could perceive the entrance from 50 yards distant, a depression in the ice field among crystalline drifts, recognizable only because he knew precisely where to search. The warded stone was completely buried, sealed under ice that had packed against it like frozen armor, requiring significant effort to clear. Vladrik worked with his protected hands, his breath coming hard despite his immortal endurance, his mind cycling through every terrible possibility. Suffocation from blocked air passages, toxic accumulation from improper ventilation, the weight of ice collapsing the chamber structure. He had calculated for cold, for wind, for heat retention. But had he calculated for this magnitude of ice, for the entrance being sealed, for air circulation being eliminated? His hands contacted the warded stone and he pressed his palm against it, activating the ancient magic, feeling the seal release with a sound like a sigh of relief. The moment he opened that entrance, warm air struck his face like an embrace. Not slightly less cold, not marginally improved, warm. He descended the passage, his eyes adjusting to the soft crimson light emanating from the roses that lined the curved walls, and he perceived them, All 12 newborns resting together among the glowing blooms, their chests rising and falling with easy breath, their eyes bright and alert as they turned to observe his arrival. The small female with midnight hair rose gracefully, stretched as though she had merely awakened from comfortable rest, and approached to study his face with curiosity and trust that made his ancient heart ache. Vladrik knelt there among the roses, surrounded by warm air and living newborns, and felt something in his chest that was larger than relief, larger than vindication. He had been correct against every voice that told him he was wrong. Against mockery and doubt and the terrible possibility of being responsible for their destruction, he had been correct. But outside that warm chamber, across the ice-covered territories, other vampire lords were counting their crystallized dead. And Vladrik understood that being correct would not feel like victory when he witnessed their faces. Vladrik remained in the chamber for an hour, examining each newborn individually, running his hands over their warm flesh, confirming what his eyes already communicated. They were not merely surviving, they were thriving. Their skin held healthy color, their breathing maintained steady rhythm, their blood flowed with proper warmth. The small female nuzzled his hand, her fangs extending slightly with hunger, behaving like a young vampire who had spent a comfortable night resting instead of one who had just survived conditions that had destroyed dozens of newborns across 3 territories. When Vladrik finally emerged back into the brutal cold, he discovered 3 black carriages positioned in his domain, their nightmare horses stamping impatiently, exhaust rising from their nostrils in white plumes against the gray sky. Lord Kale Shadowmere stood with Lord Vorn Blackwell and Lord Sauron Duskfall, all 3 ancient vampires observing the chamber entrance like it was something that might vanish if they looked away. Vladrik walked toward them, releasing the protective enchantments from his face. As he approached close enough to speak, he did not need to say anything. His expression, the manner in which he moved without urgency, without the weight of loss, communicated everything. Kale was the first to break the silence. "All of them?" he asked, his voice rough with something that might have been hope or might have been dread. Vladrik nodded slowly. "All 12, warm as if they rested before a blood fire." Lord Sauron Duskfall turned away, his ancient shoulders trembling, and Vladrik realized the Lord was weeping blood tears that froze against his pale cheeks before they could fall. Sauron had lost 16 newborns in one night, young vampires he had personally turned and mentored across their first years of immortality. Bloodlines he could not afford to lose, power that had taken centuries to accumulate. And now he stood in Vladrik Thornheart's domain, learning that a chamber filled with enchanted roses had accomplished what his ancient crypt and elaborate warming rituals could not. Vorn simply stared at the entrance to the underground chamber, his weathered face working through calculations, attempting to understand how something so simple could have functioned when everything they knew said it should have failed. Kale walked past Vladrik without requesting permission, his boots crunching through the frozen ground toward the chamber entrance. He descended into the passage, and Vladrik observed the ancient lord's back go rigid as he perceived what waited below. The warm air, the glowing roses, the 12 healthy newborns resting peacefully among the crimson blooms. Kale remained below for a long moment, and when he emerged and turned around, his face displayed something Vladrik had never witnessed there before. Not fury, not aristocratic pride, something that resembled grief mixed with shame in proportions that seemed to cause physical pain. "I lost 12, Kale said, his voice carrying across the frozen silence. 12 out of 24. The 12 still existing are so weak they might not survive another night." He looked at Vladrik, and his crimson eyes were rimmed with red that had nothing to do with their natural color. "You attempted to explain. You attempted to share the reasoning, and I laughed at you, called you senile before everyone who mattered." Vladrik did not respond. What was there to say to a vampire lord counting his crystallized dead? Sauron finally composed himself enough to speak, wiping the frozen blood tears from his face with a trembling hand. "Can you construct more?" he asked. "Can you demonstrate how?" Vladrik examined the 3 ancient lords, observed the desperation in their faces, observed the way they were looking at him now, like he possessed answers they needed to hear, like he had become something other than the fool they had mocked mere nights ago. "It is not complicated," he said. "Simply a chamber carved deep enough to reach earth warmth, its crystalline walls to hold and reflect heat. Enchanted roses cultivated from blood and shadow to draw warmth from the ground itself and multiply it. Small entrance to prevent heat escape. Allow their body heat to accomplish the work. Vorn shook his head slowly, ice crystals falling from his silver hair. We all observed you constructing it. We all believed you had surrendered to madness. He paused, looking at the entrance that had saved 12 lives, while traditional methods failed all around it. Perhaps we were the ones who had lost our minds. Cale walked back toward his carriage, opened the door, then stopped with his hand on the black iron handle. Tomorrow, he said, not looking at Vladrik, his voice carrying the weight of forced humility. Tomorrow, I'm bringing my remaining 12 newborns here, and I'm constructing a chamber beside yours. Anyone who wishes to call that foolish can observe their coven crystallize while mine survives. He climbed into the carriage and sat there, the door remaining open, staring at nothing visible. Vladrik understood. It was easier to direct fury at yourself than to confront what your certainty had cost, what your pride had destroyed. The other carriages eventually followed Cale's, pulling away slowly, leaving tracks in the ice that would remain frozen solid for weeks. Vladrik walked back toward the fortress where Celine waited at the highest window, her pale face visible against the dark stone. She did not ask about the newborns. She could perceive the answer in his movement and the way he carried himself without the weight of failure. What she did ask, after he had removed the frozen enchanted garments and stood warming his hands before the blood fire, was something else entirely. What happens now? Vladrik looked out toward the chamber entrance, toward the seemingly foolish underground garden that had become something else. Something that would change how every vampire lord in the territories thought about the lunar frost and survival, and the difference between what everyone knows and what actually works. Now, he said quietly, everyone who laughed comes asking for assistance. Lord Cale Shadowmere arrived at dusk the following night with his 12 surviving newborns transported in a specially prepared carriage in 200 enchanted rose cuttings packed in earth-filled containers. He did not knock on Vladrik's fortress doors or request permission. He simply began unloading supplies in a cleared section of Vladrik's domain. 30 feet from the original chamber, his movements quick and precise, despite the exhaustion written across his aristocratic features. Vladrik emerged with warmed blood and observed Cale work for several minutes before setting a goblet on the carriage step. Cale nodded thanks, but did not cease his efforts, directing servants to begin excavating the frozen ground with enchanted tools, measuring distances with practiced eye, adjusting the planned dimensions with the focused intensity of a vampire lord trying to save what little remained of his bloodline. Vladrik noticed Cale's hands were trembling, though whether from lingering cold or something else was impossible to determine. By the following midnight, Lord Vorn Blackwell arrived with his own contingent of servants and supplies. Then Lord Soren Duskfall, then Lord Marcus Nightwell, then vampire lords Vladrik, barely recognized from territories so distant they must have traveled through dangerous conditions for nights to reach his domain. They came with questions, with measurements taken from quick observations of Vladrik's chamber, with hope that looked painful to carry after so much loss. Vladrik found himself moving from site to site, explaining the same principles repeatedly. Walls thick enough to insulate, chamber small enough to heat efficiently, enchanted roses positioned to draw warmth from deep earth and multiply it. No external flames, no elaborate rituals, just body heat and ancient botanical magic, and the simple fact that trapped warm air stays warm if you construct the container correctly. Some of the lords took careful notes on ancient parchment. Others simply observed and attempted to copy what they saw, their faces displaying the particular concentration of immortals learning something that contradicted everything they had believed for centuries. Cale completed his chamber by the following midnight, working with the driven focus of someone racing against time that had already claimed too much. His 12 remaining newborns were weak, their blood still sluggish from the 18 hours they had spent in a crypt that could not protect them. Vladrik helped guide them into the new structure, sensing how they trembled, how their legs barely supported their weight, how their eyes had lost the bright crimson of healthy young vampires. Cale descended after them, arranging bedding among the newly planted roses with careful hands that seemed too gentle for a lord known throughout the territories for his cruelty and pride. And when he emerged, his face showed the kind of naked fear that comes from knowing you might be too late, that your arrogance might have already destroyed what you were trying to save. "Will they survive?" he asked, and it was the first time Vladrik had ever heard Lord Cale Shadowmere ask anyone's opinion about anything. Vladrik looked at the chamber, at the careful construction, at the way Cale had followed every instruction exactly despite his pride, despite the humiliation of admitting he needed guidance. If the heat retention functions as it should, if they can generate enough warmth between them, if the roses take root properly. Vladrik paused, choosing honesty over false comfort. Yes, they possess a chance. Kale nodded slowly, wiping his face with hands that had frozen earth still clinging to the elegant fingers. I destroyed 12 newborns, he said quietly, the words falling like stones into still water. Destroyed them by being too proud to listen, too certain I understood better than someone who had actually studied the problem. He looked at Vladrik with eyes that held something new, something that had not been there before the lunar frost stripped away his certainty. I require you to remember this. I require myself to remember this. What being certain cost. By the third night after the storm broke, 7 chambers stood across Vladrik's domain, ranging from perfect copies of his design to rough approximations that might function or might not. The lords who constructed them sat in their carriages or stood in small groups, drinking warmed blood from crystal goblets, speaking in low voices about losses and lessons, and the strange fact that none of them had ever questioned whether the old ways were the best ways until those ways failed completely. Vorn walked over to where Vladrik stood, surveying the collection of underground sanctuaries. You saved lives today, Vorn said, his ancient voice carrying respect that had not been there a week ago, more than simply newborns. Some of these lords, losing their covens like that, it would have broken them, ended bloodlines that stretched back millennia. Vladrik thought about Kale's trembling hands, about Saren's blood tears, about the weight of being responsible for immortal lives in a world that killed without mercy, that reminded even the undead that nature possessed powers older than any vampire. They saved themselves, Vladrik said. I simply showed them a different way to construct a sanctuary. Vorn smiled, a tired expression that held understanding accumulated across centuries. Sometimes that is all anyone requires. Someone willing to appear foolish long enough to prove they're right. He clasped Vladrik's shoulder with cold fingers and walked back toward his carriage. The moon was setting behind clouds that promised more frozen precipitation, and Vladrik understood the real test was still approaching. The chambers were constructed, the newborns were inside them, but whether they would all see another sunset, whether the desperate construction of lords racing against their own mistakes would prove sufficient, that was something only time would answer. Vladrik walked back toward his fortress where Celine waited with warmed blood and questions she knew better than to ask yet. Outside, 7 chambers of enchanted roses stood against the coming dawn, each one holding a wager that ancient botany and desperation could overcome tradition and cold. Vladrik barely entered the death sleep. Every hour he rose and looked out the window at the 7 chamber entrances scattered across his property. Dark openings against darker ice, showing no signs of what was happening beneath the frozen ground. The temperature dropped again during the day, not as brutal as the storm, but still dangerous. Still cold enough to test whether roses and hope could keep small bodies warm. Celine finally pulled him back to his resting place around the 3rd hour, her hand firm on his arm. You cannot help them by watching, she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to understand the limits of control. They either survive or they do not. Vladrik knew she was right. But knowing did not make the waiting easier. He lay there, listening to the fortress settle, to the wind that never quite ceased, to the sounds of a lunar frost night that cared nothing for the calculations of desperate immortals. Dusk came gray and cold. Vladrik was outside before the last light faded from the horizon, descending into his chamber to check on his 12 newborns first. They greeted him with the same easy alertness as the previous night, the small female with midnight hair walking over to press her cool forehead against his palm in a gesture of affection that made his ancient heart ache. He spent several minutes with them, reassuring himself that his design still functioned, that the warmth he felt was real and sustainable, that the roses still pulsed with their gentle crimson light. Then he emerged back into the cold and began making rounds to the other chambers. Kale's was closest. Vladrik called out before approaching, heard Kale's voice answer from below. And when Kale emerged from the passage, his face told the story before his words could. They survive, Kale said, and his voice cracked on the second word, breaking like ice under pressure too great to bear. All 12, warmer than yesterday, taking blood. He sat back against the frozen ground, his back against the earth beside the entrance, and covered his face with both hands. Vladrik gave him a moment, understanding that relief can strike as hard as loss sometimes, that centuries of pride collapsing into gratitude creates its own kind of devastation. Vorn's chamber held 3 newborns, and all 3 were thriving, their eyes bright, their movements strong. Saren's held 5 and 4 had survived, the 5th having been too weak from the previous night's exposure to recover even with warmth, even with the roses pulsing their gentle heat into the earth around her. Soren took the loss hard, but not with the devastation of the previous nights. One death was different from 16. One death when you expected 5 carried a different species of pain, one that could be survived. Marcus Nightwell's 2 newborns were both healthy, and he stood outside his chamber with blood tears running down his weathered face. Unable to speak, simply nodding when Vladrik asked if everything was all right. The ancient lord had lost 3 newborns when his crypt collapsed, and these 2 represented everything that remained of a bloodline he had spent 4 centuries cultivating. Of the 7 chambers constructed in those desperate hours, 5 were complete successes. One contained a newborn who crystallized overnight, likely from damage already done before she entered the warmth, her blood too sluggish to recover, even in ideal conditions. One had been excavated incorrectly, the walls too thin, and both newborns inside were dangerously cold, though still existing. Vladrik helped that lord, an ancient named Darius from the Eastern Territories, reconstruct the chamber with proper depth and thickness, moving the weakened newborns to Vorn's chamber temporarily while they worked. By midnight, every lord had checked their structures and understood what they were witnessing. The chambers worked. Not perfectly, not without risk, not as a guarantee against all loss, but they worked better than anything else these immortals had tried across millennia of existence. Better than expensive crypts with elaborate warming rituals, better than traditional methods that had been passed down for generations since the first vampires walked the night. Kale gathered everyone together near Vladrik's original chamber entrance, the lords forming a loose circle in the frozen darkness, their breath rising in white clouds that dissipated into the night. "We must discuss what happens next," Kale said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, though now that authority was tempered with something that sounded almost like humility. "We must discuss how we ensure this does not happen again." Vladrik started to step back, to let the established lords handle their business as they always had. But Kale's hand caught his arm with surprising gentleness. "No," Kale said firmly. "You are part of this conversation. Perhaps the most important part." The other lords nodded, their faces showing agreement, showing something that looked like respect earned the hardest way possible, through loss and humiliation, and the grudging acknowledgement that wisdom can come from unexpected sources. Vorn spoke next, his ancient voice carrying across the frozen ground. "The Council of Elders meets next moon cycle. We should demonstrate this technique, show everyone how it functions. And we must discuss why we all dismissed it so quickly," Soren added, his voice still rough from grief. "Why we assumed traditional methods were automatically superior, simply because they were traditional." The conversation continued. Lords who had spent the previous nights building desperate copies now speaking about refinement, about improvements, about teaching others what they had learned through loss and panic, and the humbling realization that innovation can come from anywhere, even from the vampire they had called foolish just nights before. Vladrik stood among them, listening to ancient immortals plan for a future where underground rose chambers were not ridiculous but standard, where the measure of a good lord was not whether he maintained the old ways, but whether his coven survived. The irony was not lost on him. He had constructed the first chamber to save 12 newborns. Now he was watching it change how an entire civilization of immortals thought about the lunar frost. The Council of Elders convened 3 weeks later in the great cathedral that had served as the seat of vampire governance for 2,000 years. And for the first time in living memory, every seat was filled. Lords came from 12 territories, some traveling for nights through conditions that had not fully improved since the Great Storm. They came because word had spread about what happened in the Northern Territories, about traditional crypts failing and a chamber of roses succeeding, about losses that could have been prevented, and a solution so simple that its simplicity had made it invisible to everyone except one vampire willing to be mocked. Vladrik stood at the front of the cathedral with Kale beside him, both immortals uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding that what they had to share mattered more than their discomfort. Vladrik had brought detailed drawings, measurements, preserved samples of the enchanted roses and the crystalline wall material. He had calculated costs, comparing the effort required to cultivate a rose chamber versus the effort required to maintain traditional warming rituals. The investment of power versus the value of newborns saved. The numbers spoke clearly to immortals who understood that maintaining a coven was as much mathematics as it was instinct and tradition. Kale spoke first, and his words carried weight that Vladrik's could not. Kale was known throughout the vampire world, respected. An 8th-generation lord whose bloodline name meant something in every territory. When Kale stood and told 200 vampire lords that he had called Vladrik Thornheart a fool, that he had mocked the Rose Chamber publicly and loudly, but his certainty had cost him 12 newborns, while Vladrik's innovation had saved 12. Everyone listened. "I was wrong," Kale said, his voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the ancient cathedral. "Wrong about the method, wrong about Vladrik, wrong about what it means to be a good lord." He paused, letting the words settle into the silence. Being good does not mean doing what your sire did, what his sire did before him. It means keeping your coven alive. It means being willing to look foolish if looking foolish saves lives. The cathedral was silent, except for the scratch of quills on parchment as lords took notes, as they copied the dimensions Vladrik had inscribed on the great board, as they calculated how many rose cuttings they would need for their own territories. Vorn stood next and spoke about heat retention, about the ancient botanical science Vladrik had tried to explain before the storm, and that they had all dismissed as the ramblings of a vampire who had lived too long. Soren Duskfall spoke about loss, about watching 16 newborns crystallize and knowing that hubris had destroyed them as surely as the cold, that his pride had been the true killer while he blamed the lunar frost for what his arrogance had caused. Marcus Nightwell spoke about the newborns he had saved in Vladrik's chamber after his crypt collapsed, how he had carried 2 small bodies through frozen wind expecting to bury them, and instead found warmth and survival waiting beneath the earth. One by one, the lords who had constructed chambers on Vladrik's property stood and testified to results that could not be argued with, that defied centuries of accumulated certainty. Their newborns had survived. Some had thrived. The chambers worked, and the proof was walking through halls and crypts across the territories, alive and growing stronger, when they should have been crystallized beneath layers of ice. Questions came rapidly after the testimonies concluded. How deep for different-sized covens? Whether adult vampires could benefit during extreme conditions? How to cultivate the enchanted roses properly? Whether the design could be modified for different climates, for territories where the ground itself froze solid, for regions where earth warmth was harder to access? Vladrik answered what he could, admitted what he did not know, and suggested experiments they could attempt. The knowledge belonged to anyone who needed it. Hoarding wisdom that could save lives was not wisdom at all, but a different species of cruelty. The council session that was scheduled for 1 hour extended to 4, and when it finally concluded, lords crowded around Vladrik with more questions, with requests to visit his domain, with thanks that came awkwardly from immortals not accustomed to admitting they had been wrong about anything. Kale remained after everyone else departed, helping Vladrik collect the drawings and notes scattered across ancient tables. They worked in silence for several minutes before Kale spoke. "I owe you more than an apology," he said, his voice quiet in the empty cathedral. "I owe you for the 12 newborns that survived because you were willing to appear foolish." Vladrik folded a parchment covered in calculations, considering his words carefully before responding. "You owe me nothing. You constructed your own chamber. You saved your own coven." Kale shook his head, ice-colored hair falling across his pale forehead. "I constructed it because you constructed yours first, because you were willing to be the one everyone mocked, the one everyone whispered about, the one everyone expected to fail." He paused, looking at Vladrik with an expression that was part respect, part something that might have been envy for a courage Kale was not certain he possessed. "That requires a kind of bravery I did not have. Still not certain I do." Vladrik gathered the last of the parchments, thinking about the nights he had lain awake wondering if he was destroying his newborns, about the weight of being certain when everyone else said you were wrong, about the loneliness of innovation in a world that worshipped tradition. "Was not bravery," he said finally. "Was simply mathematics and desperation, and not wanting to watch them crystallize while I did nothing." Kale smiled, a real smile this time without the edge of competition or aristocratic judgment that usually sharpened his features. Whatever it was, it saved lives, including mine, in a way. They walked out together into the cold night, and Vladimir looked up at the blood-red moon that was finally beginning to wane, its crimson light softening toward the gentler silver that would mark the end of the lunar frost season. Somewhere across the vampire territories, lords were already gathering rose cuttings, already planning excavations, already accepting that sometimes the best way forward looks ridiculous until it becomes obvious, until survival proves what argument cannot. The lunar frost was not over. More frozen nights would come before the season turned, but when they did, more newborns would survive. And that simple fact made everything else worthwhile. The season turned slowly that year, cold lingering into the fourth moon cycle. But when warmth finally returned, Vladimir Thornheart stood in his domain at dusk, watching 12 healthy young vampires who should not have existed. The small female with midnight hair had grown strong and confident, leading the small group with the assurance of an immortal who had never known true fear, who had spent the worst night in vampire memory sleeping peacefully among glowing roses. Vladimir thought about the night he had descended into that chamber, expecting to find crystallized bodies, and instead found warmth that defied everything his neighbors believed possible. The roses had been transplanted now, moved to a permanent underground garden that would serve as sanctuary for generations of newborns to come. But their impact remained visible across every territory for 1,000 leagues. Vampire lords who had never questioned tradition now questioned everything, asking not whether the old ways were comfortable, but whether they actually worked. Kale Shadowmere had become an unlikely ally and something approaching a friend. His 12 surviving newborns were now strong young vampires, and Kale spoke about the Rose Chamber at every opportunity, telling anyone who would listen about his mistakes and Vladimir's innovation with the fervor of a convert who had found truth through suffering. The two lords met weekly now, sharing warmed blood and discussing improvements to the design, talking about heat retention and rose cultivation with the enthusiasm of immortals who had discovered that learning never stopped, that every lunar frost brought new challenges requiring new solutions. Kale had constructed 3 more chambers on his property in preparation for the next season, and his public endorsement had carried weight that Vladimir's explanations alone never could. Respect earned through loss, Vladimir thought, carried a different quality than respect given easily. It lasted longer. It meant more. Vorn Blackwell had written a treatise for the council archives documenting the storm and the chambers and the survival rates that contradicted millennia of accepted practice. The treatise included detailed illustrations, precise measurements, testimonials from a dozen lords who had lost newborns in traditional crypts, while rose chambers kept their covens alive. It spread through vampire society like whispered truth, copied and passed from territory to territory, discussed in great halls and private chambers across the known world. Vladimir received messages from lords in distant territories he had never visited, all asking the same questions, all searching for ways to protect vulnerable newborns from cold that killed without mercy and without discrimination, between ancient bloodlines and common covens. He answered what he could, drew more diagrams, shared his calculations freely. The knowledge belonged to anyone who needed it. Hoarding information that could save immortal lives seemed a cruelty worse than the cold itself. The Council of Elders invited Vladimir to demonstrate the chamber design at their summer gathering, when lords from across the vampire world would assemble to discuss matters of governance and tradition. He stood on the ancient stage in front of 300 immortals, feeling absurdly out of place among beings who had shaped vampire civilization for millennia, and walked them through the construction process step by step. He showed preserved samples of the roses, explained the botanical magic that allowed them to draw warmth from deep earth, shared the cost analysis that proved chambers were simpler than elaborate warming rituals and more effective in extreme conditions. He spoke about failure as much as success, about the newborn who had crystallized despite the warmth because she had already been too damaged, about the chamber built with walls too thin that nearly cost 2 young vampires their existence. When he finished, the applause was genuine and sustained, a sound like distant thunder rolling through the cathedral. And afterward, immortals waited in line for hours to ask questions, to share their own experiences with the lunar frost, to thank him for being willing to appear foolish in service of keeping their kind alive. One ancient lord from the Western Territories, a vampire so old his name had been forgotten and replaced with simply the Elder, gripped Vladimir's hand with surprising strength and said something that stayed with him long after the gathering ended. You taught us it is acceptable to be wrong, young one, if you are willing to be right next time. Selene observed all of this from the edges of gatherings and the shadows of great halls, proud but also amused by her consort's discomfort with attention. She knew Vladrik would rather be in his domain with the newborns than on a stage with ancient lords. But she also understood that what he had done mattered beyond their small territory, beyond their bloodline, beyond anything either of them had imagined when he first sketched the chamber design on parchment by candlelight. He had changed minds that were convinced they could not be changed, had proven that innovation did not require complexity, that sometimes the best solutions were simple enough to build with materials everyone already possessed. On their chamber wall, Selene had hung the preserved rose that Vladrik had carried from the original chamber, its crimson petals still glowing faintly with the warmth that had saved 12 lives. Below it, she had inscribed a single line in the ancient tongue that captured everything that had happened. Sometimes the ridiculous is simply the obvious that nobody attempted yet. Vladrik saw it every evening when he rose and smiled, remembering the weight of being certain when everyone said he was wrong, remembering the warmth that met him when he descended into the chamber, expecting death and finding life, remembering 12 small immortals who changed how a civilization understood survival. The next lunar frost would bring more storms, more brutal cold, more nights when the blood-red moon turned the world into a frozen wasteland that tested every vampire's will to survive. But it would also bring more chambers, more lords willing to try something different, more newborns who would live because one vampire had been willing to build something everyone called stupid until it worked. That was enough. That was more than enough. The following lunar frost season arrived with warnings from the blood seers that it would rival the great storm in intensity. Lords across the territories prepared with a mixture of fear and something new, something that felt like hope built on proven success rather than tradition and prayer. Vladrik stood in his domain as the first frozen winds began to blow, watching the entrance to his original chamber where this season's 12 newborns had already been settled among the roses. Beside that entrance, 7 more chambers dotted the landscape, each one constructed by lords who had traveled to learn from him, who had swallowed their pride and admitted they needed guidance. Kale arrived as the temperature began to drop, his carriage, carrying not newborns this time but rose cuttings and crystalline wall materials for 3 lords in the southern territories who had requested his help, constructing chambers of their own. He paused beside Vladrik, both vampires watching the sky darken with the particular quality that preceded extreme cold. Different this time, Kale said quietly. Knowing what we know, having what we have, Vladrik nodded. Different, he agreed, but still dangerous. Still requires respect. Kale smiled, that new smile without edges that had replaced his old aristocratic sneer. Respect, I have learned to give. To many things I dismissed before. He climbed back into his carriage, raising a hand in farewell as the nightmare horses surged forward into the growing darkness, carrying hope and knowledge toward territories that needed both. Vladrik watched until the carriage disappeared, then turned and walked toward his fortress. Selene waited at the window as she always did, her pale face a beacon against the dark stone. Behind him, the chamber entrances stood ready, roses glowing beneath the frozen earth, warmth waiting to embrace the vulnerable and protect them through whatever the lunar frost would bring. The storm came 3 nights later with fury that matched the bloodseer's warnings. Its wind howled across the territories like the voices of ancient hungry things, and temperatures plummeted to depths that made even the oldest vampires retreat to their deepest sanctuaries. But this time, across 12 territories, rose chambers glowed beneath the frozen earth. This time, newborns rested in warmth while the world above tried to destroy everything that dared to exist. Vladrik descended into his chamber at the height of the storm, not from fear this time, but from a desire to witness what he had created, to sit among the roses and the sleeping newborns and feel the warmth that had once seemed impossible. The small female with midnight hair lifted her head when he entered, recognized him, and settled back among the crimson blooms with a sound of contentment that made his ancient heart ache with something he had not felt in centuries. Pride, perhaps, or something deeper. The knowledge that he had left the world better than he found it, that his existence had meaning beyond mere survival. When the storm broke 2 nights later, the reports came flooding through the psychic channels. Not reports of loss this time, not the brutal accounting of crystallized newborns and shattered bloodlines. Reports of survival, reports of chambers that held through the worst conditions in memory, reports of lords weeping with relief instead of grief. Cale transmitted from the Southern Territories, where he had helped construct 3 chambers in the final nights before the storm. All 3 had held. All the newborns had survived. The lords who had mocked Cale for traveling so far to help lesser bloodlines now stood in his debt, their gratitude a currency more valuable than any ancient treasure. "We did something that mattered," Cale transmitted, his mental voice carrying wonder that seemed strange coming from a vampire who had once believed he already knew everything worth knowing. "We actually changed something." Vladrik stood at his fortress window, watching servants clear ice from the pathways, watching the first newborns emerge from the chambers to test their strength in the gentler cold that followed the storm. The small female with midnight hair walked among them, no longer the smallest, no longer the most vulnerable. She had grown into something strong and certain, a vampire who would carry the memory of warmth through whatever frozen nights her immortal existence would bring. "We changed something," Vladrik agreed through the psychic link. "Whether it lasts depends on those who come after." But watching the young vampires explore their world, watching lords who had once mocked him, now teaching others to build chambers, watching knowledge spread like warmth itself through a civilization that had believed it already knew everything worth knowing, Vladrik allowed himself to believe that some changes lasted, some innovations became tradition, some foolishness became wisdom when enough time passed and enough lives were saved. The Bloodseers predicted a mild season for the following year, then 3 harsh ones in succession. Lords across the territories began planning, began expanding their chamber networks, began training others in cultivation techniques that Vladrik had developed through years of patient experimentation. The knowledge was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who needed it, and that felt right in a way that hoarding it never could have. Celine found him in the rose garden one evening, surrounded by blooms that pulsed with gentle crimson light, his hands deep in the warm earth that had saved so many lives. She knelt beside him, her elegant gown collecting soil stains she did not seem to notice or care about. "You are thinking about legacy," she said, not a question. Vladrik nodded slowly, feeling the warmth of the earth against his palms, feeling the pulse of the roses like heartbeats surrounding him, thinking about what remains when we are gone, what we leave behind that matters. Celine leaned against his shoulder, her presence a comfort that required no words. "You leave behind 12 newborns who would not exist without you. Hundreds more across the territories. A way of thinking that did not exist before you were willing to be mocked for it." She paused, her hand finding his beneath the warm soil. "That is legacy enough for any immortal." Vladrik looked at the roses, at the chamber that had started as desperate calculation and become something that changed how his entire civilization understood survival. He thought about Cal, transformed from his loudest critic into his closest ally, about Vorn and Saren and Marcus and all the others who had learned through loss what they could have learned through listening, about the small female with midnight hair who would live for millennia because he had been willing to build something ridiculous. The lunar frost would return, as it always did. The blood-red moon would rise again, bringing cold that killed without mercy. But now, across the vampire territories, warmth waited beneath the frozen earth. Roses glowed in underground chambers. Newborns slept peacefully while storms raged above them. And somewhere in the great archives of vampire civilization, Vladrik's name would be recorded, not as a fool who wasted his power-growing flowers, but as the Lord who taught immortals that wisdom sometimes looks like foolishness, that innovation sometimes requires the courage to be mocked, that the difference between tradition and truth is measured in lives saved. That was enough. That was more than enough. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale.